In the skies over Europe of World War II, an intense battle took place for air superiority between Britain, her allies, and Nazi Germany. This conflict produced some of the most iconic aircraft in the history of warfare. On the Axis side, the Stuka, the Messerschmitt 109, and the Focke-Wulf 190. And for the Allies, the Mustang, the Hurricane, and the famous Spitfire, just to name a few. But there was another aircraft from this theater of battle that, despite being far less known, played a huge part towards Allied victory. That was the Hawker Typhoon. The Typhoon was a beast of an aircraft. 25% larger than any other single-seater, it could also fly faster than any other fighter aircraft of the day, Allied or Axis. Brainchild of the famous aircraft designer Sir Sidney Cam, father of the RAF workhorse, the Hawker Hurricane, the Typhoon was intended to replace the Hurricane as an interceptor. However, having been rushed into service in 1941, the Typhoon had its share of teething problems with both airframe and its newly developed Napier Sabre engine. A 24-cylinder, 37-liter monster was the first piston engine to produce over 2,000 horsepower. It soon became clear that the Typhoon was not a good fit as a fighter, but with its exceptional speed and performance at low altitudes, it was an ideal weapon platform for ground attack. The Typhoon was one of the first aircraft to be used in tactical ground support and played a pivotal role in the Normandy landings and the liberation of Europe through to VE Day. It was as respected by Allied troops as much as it was feared by the Germans. Late in the war, Typhoon squadrons were sortied over occupied France, Holland, and Belgium with orders to hit anything that moved, and hit they did. Armed with 4 Hispano 20mm cannons, bombs, and wing-mounted rockets, Typhoon pilots would engage in destroying enemy convoys, tank formations, artillery positions, and even moving trains with lethal results. The punch of a Typhoon's cannons could knock over rail cars and burst open speeding locomotives like pop cans. German convoy drivers reportedly removed the doors of their transports to have better odds of escaping a Typhoon attack. Over 3,000 examples of Hawker Typhoon were built by the Gloucester Aircraft Company in England during World War II. Yet despite its notoriety and exceptional contribution to the war effort, not one airworthy example of this venerable aircraft exists today. But one man is in the process of changing that. Ian Slater is founder of Typhoon Legacy with the goal of restoring an airworthy example of the famous Hawker Typhoon. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you very much, Brad.
Ian, this project is not only bringing back into history a Hawker Typhoon, but a specific airframe, that of JP-843. What is the relevance of JP-843, and why did you choose this airframe for resurrection?
JP-843 is a very interesting airframe, actually. It was originally built as one of the early car door type Hawker Typhoons and eventually modified to the sliding hood. A lot of people call that a bubble canopy, but the sliding hood canopy. It was built in September of 1943, and it was delivered to 197 Squadron operating as a Bombfoon Squadron. By February of 1944, it was kind of becoming obsolete, and it was sent back for modifications to the sliding hood canopy and rocket projectiles, and then redelivered back to 609 Squadron in June of 1944, just after the invasion of Normandy, June 8th, 1944. So it's got a lot of history to it, but ultimately what you need to be able to put an aircraft back in the air is an identity. And you can't, because of the weight of the aircraft, you can't just build one and have a replica or an example of it. It's too heavy for that. So you need an identity to be able to put it in Canada, what we call the limited category, a special C of A. So we were able to find, along with some of the components that we purchased, a stenciled serial number JP-843 on some of the wreckage, which is enough for us to be able to proceed with the rebuild on the aircraft. And that's because the Hawker Typhoon actually never carried a data plate like other aircraft, the Hurricane, the Spitfire. It was only ever painted on the rear of the aircraft. And then sometimes when it went back for modifications, stenciled on firewalls, and personnel would stencil it on other panels. So that's the component that we are able to find an original stenciled serial number on and base our entire rebuild.
But like you said, few remnants of the Typhoon exist today, other than wrecks and components and pieces. I believe there's one airframe that's still intact but doesn't fly. And all the blueprints were destroyed after World War II. So how are you able to get the information you need to restore this aircraft?
That's a massive project. And that's taken well over a decade. It really, when I was a kid, I started researching this stuff, but with effort of multiple volunteers, well over a decade of researching this. The Typhoon is unlike other aircraft that you see in substantial numbers, like the Spitfires and the Mustangs, where the data survived, the engineering drawings survived, and people were able to rebuild the aircraft. The aircraft themselves survived in greater numbers, where the Typhoons were destroyed post-war. So the information was there for those. The information was very thoroughly destroyed for the Typhoon, being superseded immediately post-war. The job was done. They got rid of it. And I mean, in fairness to the guys at the factories, I guess they look at the design of that aircraft. They'd advanced beyond that, and they just, I mean, some companies were actually burning the aircraft drawings for the aircraft in courtyards. And I don't know exactly what happened to the Typhoon's drawings. We've found quite a few of them, but not enough to build the aircraft. So it's a treasure hunt is what I refer to it as, to get that information. And we need to scour the earth, talk to people, find surviving parts to fill in the gaps from the drawings that we do have, reverse engineer those, build them into models, verify them, produce the tooling, produce the parts, assemble the parts, and build the aircraft. So it's a very laborious process to get the information. And that's without even getting into the metallurgy side of it, and the fact that the materials from the war don't necessarily exist in parallel today, and we have to do engineering to supersede some of those and use modern materials. So it's a great deal of work.
I'm sure. And not to mention, these planes were built quite quickly, still almost in prototype phase, and kind of chucked in the air with not much thought towards the future of these aircraft. And there's also a lot of modifications that were put involved too. And I'm sure you're coming across a lot of that, where just a short amount of aircraft have different modifications in it that you have to adapt and work around. And also you have to put an aircraft in the air that's going to hold up to modern standards of being safe as well.
It's pretty tricky. There's a substantial volume of modifications to Typhoons, and some of them are frustratingly limited on information. Actually, the sliding hood modification 307 is one of them. It was a substantial modification that was done at contractor. So the mod reference is actually basically just saying it's going to be done at contractor, and the information isn't there. We are fortunate with our drawings that we're able to kind of reverse engineer from the drawings individual sections, components that were part of that modification to help us with it. But it's very important that those are put in correctly. There's some modifications on the Typhoon that aren't really necessary. If you look at the 4-blade propeller, it was added later in the war. It's considered a modification, and it ties into the tail and the elevator mass balance weights and all that good stuff. But they also continued to operate Typhoons with a 3-blade propeller and small tailplane. So we have to really work through them, identify why they're implemented, exactly what was implemented, and what needs to be there to make JP843 safe.
Talk to me a bit about the one surviving airframe. That has an interesting story all to itself. And I believe it's in England right now, and it's on static display. And I think that's helped you out a little bit too. Can you tell a little bit about that airframe?
Oh, we're so fortunate. That airframe is MN235, and it was built as an original sliding hood canopy aircraft and delivered to the United States for evaluation. I believe it's only got 9 hours on the airframe. They had a small incident with it, and they determined they weren't going to do anything with Typhoon, so they packed it up, stuck it in crates, and that was it. But it survived by fluke. It came back to the UK in a trade for the Hawker Hurricane from the Smithsonian. And we're very, very fortunate that Hawker Typhoon MN235 is a small tailplane aircraft, because there's a bunch of changes in that structure. And now we've got an aircraft that we can go to and reference. We've used it several times for measurements to identify exactly what's going on. Fin is a good example. Later Mark Typhoons have a 1-inch thinner fin than MN235. JP843 and MN235 were within the same couple batches, same production variants. So very fortunate that the information contained in that aircraft is relevant to our Typhoon. We've also done, when it was on loan very generously from the RAF to Canada in Ottawa, we were permitted to do a wing scan on it. So we digitally scanned the entire wing to help us with some of the information on the rebuild. So it has been, and it will continue to be, a very valuable resource in identifying exactly what we're doing going forwards.
Wow. And again, there's a bit of a community in the world of finding wrecks that are still being discovered. Is that true?
Oh yeah. There's fewer and fewer being discovered, and actually, I just got back from Europe where I was talking to some of the guys that have historically done typhoon recoveries, and the biggest problem is that there's no survivors, witnesses to identify exactly what happened and where. The information is there, and it gives rough coordinates, but without somebody to tell you which part of a quarter section of land to dig in, you don't really know. So those people are really what have made the possibility of a Hawker Typhoon rebuild possible. They through the 60s and 70s, when everybody wanted to forget the war, when everything was going to scrap and being destroyed, they were the ones that were preserving it and showing the history. And it's because they preserved those very specific components that we have access to the information that we need to be able to do this and fill the gaps in for JP843. So without them, it couldn't be done. So everybody that's attempted anything Typhoon related over the last 50, 60 years, this is because of them.
Right. And there is a Warbird community, in Europe, New Zealand, Australia, here in Canada as well, that rebuild airframes. Hurricanes are very popular. Spitfires are very popular. And fortunately, there's more being restored. A little tougher for you because there are no proper airframes that are restored except for the one. Tell me a little bit about the community of restoring warbirds and how you involved with that and how helpful that might be.
It's huge. Actually, Darcy Barker from the KF Aerospace Center for Excellence, I don't want to steal his quote, so absolute credit to him, but nobody can do this alone. We need to work together. We need to share resources. Everybody either has something or has access to something that can help somebody else with their project. And every one of us benefits from working together. And the success of this project is going to be due to a lot of people that have helped. And they might not even be mentioned in some of the videos, but that aspect, that single component couldn't have happened without their input and their expertise.
Right, because they're currently well on their way of restoring a Tempest, and there's shared components between the Tempest and Typhoon.
There are, yeah. There's quite a few, but as you kind of move forward with the rebuild, I would like there to be more because there's more Tempests around. But primarily, there's shared components within the monocoque section after the cockpit, I won't even say that. After the cockpit to the transport joint, and even in the fin area and rear monocoque, there's some. But there's also different assembly drawings, so you have to be very careful that they might share components, but the assemblies are different. So they don't share all the components. And it's another one of those things that you have to research very thoroughly before you get into it.
Right. I mean, we're talking a totally different airplane, really. The Tempest was new wings and...
Well, ultimately, and that's what Hawker realized when they were doing it. They went to create the Typhoon 2. They replaced the wing because they needed a thinner wing. And then they realized that the amount of fuel that they took out of the wing with the thinner one had to be added somewhere. So they lengthened the nose, put a fuel tank in there. And then there's stability issues with the longer nose. So they put the big fillet on the tail and they put a larger tailplane on. So it just kind of snowballed into the fact that, okay, guys, now we've got a new aircraft. So they called it the Tempest.
Right. Yeah. So this project is a bit of a holy grail of Warbird projects, Ian. Not only restoring an airframe that hasn't flown in over 80 years, but the Napier Sabre engine hasn't turned an angle in over 50. So you are not only building an airframe, but you have to build a power plant from the ground up. Tell us a bit about the Napier Sabre.
Yeah, those are the Typhoon and the Sabre. As much as they're one project, they're two separate projects. And they're both massive for the same reasons. The information didn't survive for the Sabre in complete detail. So it's another treasure hunt to find that information, to find parts. There's what I'd say 40 or less Napier Sabre engines known to survive. I'm hoping there's a lot more out there hidden away. But most of those are crash recovered. We've got a Napier Sabre 2A that's sitting here. It's a crash recovered engine, and it really... for the state that we're at right now, it's not going to provide too much value to the project. So we'll use it for display and telling the story of the engine and the aircraft, the pilots, and all that good stuff. But the engines are rare. We have a Sabre 7 cutaway here as well that's going to really help us with some information and some parts. But we're still piecing together the plan on the engine side of the whole project, because it's a mammoth task to take something that's, I'd say, fairly poorly documented, that there's no surviving experience that can help with putting it back in the air, and develop a program to make it fly safely in an airframe.
So the Typhoon had its share of teething problems, not just with the airframe, Ian, but also with the engine. But I also can't help but think that it wasn't getting a lot of help from the get-go. I know that originally when Sidney Cam was designing the airframe, Rolls-Royce was putting forth an engine, the Vulture, to be able to power that aircraft. And they eventually dropped the Vulture for the Napier Sabre. But am I to understand too that they didn't get a lot of help? Napier didn't get a whole lot of help from other manufacturers when developing this engine?
Yeah, you're correct with that. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of politics going on.
Even in wartime.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think especially in wartime, there's a lot of money being doled out, and a lot of people want the contracts. So and fair enough. Bristol was brought in. The Sabre early on was only getting about 25 hours between overhauls. It basically turned into a brick. And it was an issue with the sleeves, the metallurgy in the sleeves, the way that they're produced, going out of round, the high tolerances in them, oil, all sorts of issues around that area. So it was Bristol, who had already been working on sleeve valves for some time, in fact, had put £2 million sterling into the development of sleeve metallurgy with a company called Firth Vickers. And this was about 1936 when they did that. And they had a couple engines, the Bristol Taurus, and the Hercules came around, and eventually the Centaurus. And they'd proven their recipe to make these sleeves function reliably. And the Air Ministry heavy-handedly requested that Bristol share that technology with Napier to help save the Sabre program. And they did. They shared it. And interestingly enough, they actually took the sleeve blank from the Bristol Taurus engine that had the same bore as the Napier Sabre and machined one of those to fit the Sabre. They made the engine run reliably, and the technology really saved the Sabre.
It was amazing stuff for late 30s, early 40s that we kind of take for granted today with our technology.
I'm everything about the aircraft, everything about the engine. I'm always amazed at the metallurgy and the engineering and the knowledge that went behind making these decisions. There were some very smart people involved in it. And I think we better be careful with the way things are going now, because we're going to lose all of that knowledge and the ability to think that clearly. It's very impressive what they did.
Absolutely. And all done on paper with slide rules. No calculators, no computers, nothing.
Yeah, no CAD. One interesting side note fact was I think there was over 150,000 man hours in converting the Rolls-Royce Merlin over to the Packard Merlin to change their threads and all that good stuff. And that's one of those things that I might be slightly off on the numbers, but it was substantial. It's one of those things now where if it was all done in CAD, you'd transfer it to somebody, hit a button, it would convert it for you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, night and day on how things are done.
And just a little more on the Napier Sabre. Even if you look at it, first of all, it's huge. It's a massive engine. But it's also, you see a Merlin, which is the classic World War II engine, and it's a V12. And obviously smaller, but the Napier Sabre being basically a flat 212 pancake engines put together. So sure. 4 banks of 6. And the sleeve valves to help it out. It's quite a unique engine too, and that's probably one of the reasons why it had all those teething problems, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it was new technology, and there were problems with the ground crew adjusting or making adjustments that were causing issues with boost and causing aircraft to crash. They didn't know it. They were taught standard poppet valve engines, and they took courses on this stuff, but it was still new technology. So there's a lot of teething problems associated with learning too. Production and learning, I think, were probably the 2 big ones.
The whole thought of Typhoon is interesting, how it came in so late. I mean, starting to be developed so late in the beginning of World War II. But the fact they got it in the air, and yes, there were a lot of fatalities and crashes, but the fact that they got it in the air and got it working, and the history that it managed to fulfill during World War II is pretty interesting in itself. Ian, a bit about yourself. You are a licensed aircraft maintenance engineer. You served over 16 years in the Royal Canadian Air Force as an aircraft structural technician. You have experience with servicing fixed and rotary-winged aircraft for both military and civilian, from the Middle East to the Canadian Arctic. Tell us a bit about your history with servicing aircraft and how it brought you here.
Well, actually, the Typhoon brought me to servicing aircraft. I discovered the aircraft when I was quite young, and I catered my career to being able to rebuild it. I think sort of jumping into the idea that it was possible to have an airworthy Typhoon as a 12-year-old was pretty naive and not knowing the facts, slowly realizing that they just didn't exist and there's no information for them was a little bit disheartening. But I stuck with the career to rebuild one as I figured that stuff out. And the military was the best way. I tried when I was a little bit younger to go through college and high school. I was in a program that did that, but it was for a millwright and not aircraft structures. So I ended up joining the military as aircraft structures, partially because of my interest in military operations and the Hawker Typhoon and the trade. So really, the Typhoon brought me to the career.
And you served in Squadrons 438 and 440 of the Royal Canadian Air Force, and both of which were Typhoon squadrons in World War II. Was that by accident?
I think, 438 Squadron was actually my training squadron. I was posted to them while I was going through a civilian college for aircraft structures training. So as a member of 438 Squadron there, I got to know Colonel Andre Lord, who was the honorary colonel of 438 Squadron, and Frank Dutiel was a good friend of mine who was very into the history. And so it was a bit of a fluke, but I was very fortunate to be part of that. 440 Squadron I tried for several years. It was an isolated posting, so you have to apply for it and you have to go through testing and be approved for it. I was very fortunate to get up there, and yeah, absolutely wonderful posting, great people, small, very communal type organization. Everybody had each other's back, so great stuff, and a little bit of work by me to get up there, I suppose. But an honor to have served with both of them.
And you started this project in 1991, and where are you currently on the project, and who do you have helping you out along the way?
Well, I'll say 1991 is when I found the Typhoon and set my mind to this. I was 12 at the time, so yeah, I wasn't squishing rivets and bending metal at that point in time. But it took a lot of research. I'd say really things started to roll quite well in about 2009. It's when I found out I'd actually given up on the Hawker Typhoon because there just wasn't information, and every turn seemed to be a failure. There wasn't anything there, so I'd also been researching west coast of Canada crash sites and information, and quite into the hurricane. So I was going to take on a hurricane project instead. And I bought some hurricane drawings from a fellow, and I noticed that there's a couple drawings in there that were actually similar parts with Typhoon. And I got a hold of him and said, "Do you have more drawings that have the Typhoon in them?" "Oh yeah, I think the guy has 12,000 drawings." "What? Are you kidding me?" So I quickly sold off all my hurricane stuff and jumped back into the Typhoon and haven't given up since. So 2009 was a key time period to acquire those. And I should also say that they were very expensive, and I had to sell. I had a little Cessna 150 I had to sell off at a huge loss to be able to buy them. There's a bit of a time restraint on that, so I got that done. But since then, since I got back from Afghanistan, I've been able to build the shop and really kind of take the information that we had, identify all the loopholes or the missing areas that we needed to fill, and start advancing. And I'd say around 2012, I was able to complete the shop for the rebuild and start to network with people that might be interested. And we started off with Graham Sutherland in New Zealand and Graham Allen. And my father was still working at the time, but he slowly partook more in it as a CAD designer, and people just came on board that were interested in seeing what was going on and wanted to be part of it. So it's still happening today.
And this project, JP843, is entirely funded by donation. And every dollar that is donated goes directly to the design and build of this project, correct?
It does, yeah. One of the things that I set forth with part of my career was an understanding that the biggest cost of this would be labor. So my career has been dedicated to providing the labor for the airframe side anyway. I can do all the metal work for it and basically build the structure of the aircraft. But there's still a lot of funding requirement beyond the labor. There's materials and sometimes specialized services. Right now is a good example of that. We're moving on to the cockpit section. And while we can do machining in-house here, the main spar fittings are so large, the bores are so deep that we just can't do it. And we've had to raise funds to be able to do that. So we've managed to create a program to build this aircraft that is relatively inexpensive in comparison to other projects. But we do need funding. We do need regular funding. And we do that through donations, through crowdfunding campaigns sometimes. but primarily through people that just want to help and see this succeed. We ask them to head to our website, and if they're able to, even a dollar here or a dollar there through PayPal, it's all secure. It makes a big difference to us.
Well, with that, I'd like to wrap up this introduction podcast of Typhoon Legacy, the project to restore Hawker Typhoon JP843 to airworthy status. If you'd like to find out more about JP843 or wish to donate to the project, go to typhoonlegacy.com. Thank you for joining us. We would look forward to any comments or suggestions you may have for future episodes. We would love to hear from you. Thank you, Ian Slater, and a shout out to our producer, Rob Hunt. I'm your host, Brad Hodson. Thank you for joining us.